I know we already covered this slide, but it leads to the next series of slides, and which is going to finish us up for this unit. So this list is a list of evidence, modern evidence, that evolution has occurred on this planet and is continuing to occur. So the first thing on the list is fossils. Fossils is are some of the most convincing evidence that evolution has occurred. It's very evident from the fossil record that species have changed over time. And as we dig down in the Earth's crust, we find that the crust is arranged in layers, and these layers are known as strata. So geologic strata refers to the sedimentary layers observed in the Earth's crust. Sedimentary referring to the sediment that sinks out of aquatic environments and ends up piling up on the bottom of aquatic environments, but also terrestrial environments. There's dust that's constantly settling and building up layers even on land. And that tends to bury things. And when so if something living dies and it doesn't completely decompose, then it gets buried by the sediments, and the sediments eventually turn into sedimentary rock. And those living things are then trapped and preserved as fossils in that sedimentary rock. Older strata are found deeper in the crust, so the farther down you dig, the farther back in time you're going. And in this figure, you can see that the fossils are changing as we go from shallower to more deep in the strata. But the strata-time relationship does not always hold true due to what could be referred to as geologic upheaval. In other words, big geological changes, big changes in the Earth's crust. For example, we see a little fault right here, a little crack, a little shift in how the sedimentary layers line up. But the biggest things are like mountain building. So, for example, all the way at the very bottom here are fossils that would represent the Cambrian period, which is it's about 570 million years ago. And some of the best fossils that we find from the Cambrian period are actually found at the very top of mountains, or found in the mountains. So that was an aquatic, all those species were aquatic, and they're now found at the top of a mountain. Their fossils are found at the top of a mountain. So that's an example of how geologic upheaval can change the position of the strata. The fossil record is clear evidence that life has evolved, that life has changed over time. And I want you to get some sense, and you can get some of that sense from this figure. And this is just a figure, it's not real. It was created by an artist, a biological artist, or a geological artist, or a paleontological artist. But anyway, if you look closely at the kind of organisms that we find in this figure, you can see that they start with invertebrates. In other words, animals that don't have a backbone. And again, that's about 570 million years ago in the Cambrian period, where animals seem to just appear in the fossil record kind of all of a sudden. It's not really all of a sudden, but it kind of appears to be because they have hard parts. But they don't have a backbone. They don't have an endoskeleton or a backbone. So they are invertebrates, right? Vertebrates have a backbone. Invertebrates don't have a backbone. Then we see the evolution of vertebrates, and the first vertebrates are fish, like we see here. Fish gave rise to amphibians, which are represented here. Amphibians gave rise to reptiles, and some of the most famous reptiles are dinosaurs, but not all of the reptiles were dinosaurs that were alive early on. And then reptiles give rise to both birds and mammals. So notice that reptiles are branching off here to birds and mammals, represented here by the feathered fossil, and then up here, mammalian skulls, including our own, including humanoid skulls. Here we see the concept of biogeography, and as you can see here, we're looking at a map of the Galapagos Islands. And again, the Galapagos are not far from the coast of South America, Ecuador, and each island pretty much has a different habitat. In other words, the habitats vary widely from island to island on the Galapagos. And here we see some of the finch species that are found on the Galapagos, and here we see a phylogenetic tree showing how the finch species are related to each other by common ancestry. So this blue-black grasswit is considered to be the common ancestor of the finches found on the Galapagos Islands, and all the finches of the Galapagos are thought to have evolved and diverged from that one common ancestor, the blue-black grassquit. So Darwin concluded, when he observed all the different finch species, he concluded that the similarities between the finch species were due to common ancestry. In other words, the similarities between finch species was homologous, right? Similarities that arise due to common ancestry, that's what we call a homologous structure or homologous similarity. He also concluded that the differences between Galapagos finch species was due to their evolutionary adaptation to different niches found on different islands. Because, like I said, the different islands have different habitats, different niches, different environments. And life will find a way. If there's a way to make a living, if there's a niche to fill, species will evolve to fill that niche. So we end up with all kinds of different species that arise from one ancestral species because they have diverged to fill all the niches that are available on the Galapagos Islands. And there are, a lot of niches. He also concluded, though, that species on the same island can be inferred to share closer common ancestry due to biogeography. In other words, a finch may find its way to an island. So let's say that one finch species finds its way to Isabella, and there are many different niches to fill on Isabella, and that finch species is the common ancestor of all the different finch species that eventually are living on Isabella. That's the idea, that the species that are found on the same island are more likely to be closely related to each other because they have all evolved together and from each other on the same island. Darwin then realized that he could expand that idea from islands to continents. I mean, if you think of these separate islands as the separate continents on the planet Earth, the same can be said for the continents, that the species that are found on the same continent can be inferred to be more closely related to the species that are found separated on different continents. That's the idea of biogeography. Continuing with the idea of biogeography, it can be used to explain why there are so many marsupial mammals living in Australia. The idea is that they have common ancestry, that ancestral marsupial species that were living in Australia over the millions of years has given rise to all the different species of marsupials that now live in Australia. And there were marsupials in other parts of the world too, but many of them have gone extinct and been out-competed by the placental mammals. So you may not be familiar with this, but there are marsupial mammals and placental mammals. Humans, you are a placental mammal, and all the mammals in North America are placental mammals, except for the possum. The possum is the one and only marsupial that we have in North America, but Australia has a lot of marsupials. But what this figure is showing is the similarity in morphology referring to the shape or the form of an animal in this case, the similarity in morphology between marsupial mammals and placental mammals. For every marsupial mammal here, there is a placental mammal that looks very similar to it. So there's a marsupial mouse and a placental mouse, a marsupial wolf and a placental wolf, and so on. And they look very similar to each other, a marsupial mole and a placental mole. And the reason they look so similar to each other is not because of common ancestry. They live on completely different continents and have been evolving separately for a long time. So they're not very closely related to each other. The idea is that they have adapted to the same niche, or a similar niche, I should say a similar niche. And because they have adapted to a similar niche, that makes them look similar. So this is known as Convergent evolution. Convergent evolution, where two species look similar to each other because they have adapted to similar habitats or similar niches. And their similarity in structure is referred to as analogous, not homologous. It's like the opposite of homologous. So analogous structure is structure or morphology that results from convergent evolution, where two species look similar because they have adapted to a similar niche. We see the same thing in this comparison of North American and South American species, and we're only looking at a couple different species, and all four of these species are placental mammals. But you can see that the beaver and the muskrat look very similar to the capybara and the quapu, but not because of common ancestry. They've been evolving separately for a long time, but they have adapted to very similar niches. The beaver and the capybara and the muskrat and the quapu, they occupy very similar niches, and therefore have analogous structure that has resulted from convergent evolution. So convergent evolution results in morphological similarity between unrelated species due to adaptation to a similar niche. And analogous structure refers to the product of convergent evolution. In other words, it's the opposite of homologous structure. Homologous structure results from common ancestry. Analogous structure results from convergent evolution. That's what you need to know and keep straight. Speaking of homologous structure, it itself is evidence of common ancestry, and anything that is evidence of common ancestry is evidence of evolution. So in this figure, we're looking at a phylogenetic tree of fish, reptiles, birds, and mammals, and the question is, what's missing? Fish, reptiles, birds, mammals, where are the amphibians? So what's missing are amphibians. I just wanted to point that out for no particular reason. The color coding suggests that the bone structure of these vertebrates is homologous. And we've seen a figure similar to this before. And the idea is that because all these different species, all these different vertebrate species evolved from a common ancestor fish, they all have similar bone structure, the same bones and the same general arrangement. They've all simply been modified to carry out different functions, right? And that's homologous structure. And that's evidence of common ancestry. The fact that they all have the same bones and the same general arrangement suggests that they all arose from a common ancestor. And in this case, that would be this ancient lobe-finned fish that had the same bone structure as we see in these terrestrial vertebrates, what we would refer to as tetrapods, because they all have 4 limbs. So homologous structure is similar morphology due to descent from a common ancestor. Descent from a common ancestor. The bone structure is not identical between these different species because these appendages have evolved to carry out different functions. That's an example of divergent evolution. Wherever you see in a phylogenetic tree branching from common ancestry, that's known as divergence, right? So all these different species have diverged from this common ancestor lobe-finned fish. If you look at the structure of a whale skeleton, you'll find bones that represent the pelvic girdle. Now, you have a pelvic girdle, you have a pelvis that your legs attach to. But what the heck is a whale doing with bones that represent the pelvis, or, when they don't have legs? Well, they're leftovers. They're known as vestigial structures, or vestigial organs. And they're evidence of evolution. They're evidence that whales have common ancestry with species that had legs, or that they descended from species that had legs. And they still have these hip bones because they haven't completely evolved away yet. They're vestigial. They're leftovers, evolutionary leftovers. Same with snakes. Snakes have common ancestry with reptiles that had legs. They no longer have legs, but they still have vestigial structures, both inside. They have hip structures also, just like whales do. But even on the outside, you can see claws. On some species of snakes, there are claws on either side of the cloaca. Their cloaca is the one opening that everything comes out of. And those claws are vestigial. They're vestigial structures, evolutionary leftovers from legs. You have a vestigial structure too, your appendix. Humans no longer use their appendix for anything. You can have your appendix taken out and it's not going to affect you in any way. And that's because it's an evolutionary leftover. It's a vestigial structure. It no longer carries out a function. But it did in our ancestors. So that's the idea of vestigial. Vestigial organs, vestigial structures are homologous structures that no longer have a function. They're evolutionary leftovers. Analogous structures arise from convergence and are morphologically similar due to adaptation to a similar niche or function. So again, just like on the previous slide, I'm trying to point out the difference between homologous, which is what we're looking at here, and analogous, which is what we were looking at on the previous slide when it comes to, for example, comparing marsupial mammals to placental mammals. They look similar even though they're not closely related to each other. They have analogous structure. This shows how we can use embryology, in other words, the development of an embryo and a fetus into a new individual, and make comparisons between embryonic development between different species to show how closely related they are. So if we look at the embryonic development of these different species in this figure, we've got fish and salamander, so a fish, an amphibian, reptile, bird, and then 4 different kinds of mammals. If you look at their very early embryonic development, they all look almost identical, almost exactly the same, which shows common ancestry, which supports the idea that all these different animal species are closely related to each other, relatively closely related to each other. But as we go to the next stage of embryonic development, we see some divergence. We see some differentiation between them. For example, the fish and amphibians kind of separate themselves out earlier in development as being different, and it's because they are more closely related to each other. Fish and amphibians have an aquatic lifestyle, or live in aquatic habitats, and therefore they diverge and embryonically diverge from the other, to the development of these other species earlier on. And as we go further in embryonic development, we see more divergence. In other words, the next ones to kind of separate themselves out are the reptiles and the birds, and that's because they are very closely related to each other. And then these mammals, even at this later stage in embryonic development, look very similar to each other, including humans. So that's the idea, that we can see evolutionary relationship as we compare embryonic development in different species. So more closely related species have more similar embryonic development. There's this concept known as ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. That's a mouthful. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, and it simply translates to embryonic development, which is ontogeny. So that one word, ontogeny, means embryonic development. Recapitulates kind of means replays, right? So like when you replay a video, right? You play it again. Phylogeny refers to evolutionary relationship or evolution, right? So ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny means embryonic development replays evolution. And it's a concept, it's an idea, it's an inference that could be made from this kind of evidence, comparing embryonic development between species. But it's really not supported by experimental evidence. Therefore, it's not accepted as fact, right? It's an interesting idea, and it kind of seems to be what's going on, but it's not supported as fact. I just wanted you to be aware of that, though. Okay, so this slide, we're supposed to summarize Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, and that is the way you should say it. You shouldn't just say Darwin's theory of evolution. again, Darwin didn't invent evolution. He wasn't the first one to start thinking about that species change over time, or to observe that species change over time. What he did do was figure out how species change over time, which is through natural selection primarily. So what you want to remember, what you want to be able to recite actually are the 4 parts of natural selection. And it would be best to be able to recite these from memory. So in other words, genetic variation, overproduction of offspring, the struggle for existence, and differential survival and reproduction. And I know that can be kind of hard to remember, but you might be able to figure out some trick to remember it. But one way to think about them is that they're at least 3 of them are related to each other. So let's just go through them one at a time and summarize like we're supposed to here. So genetic variation, individual organisms differ, right? There's variation between individuals of the same species. And some of this difference is heritable. In other words, genetic. It can be passed on from parents to offspring. It's heritable. You can inherit it. Overproduction of offspring. Organisms produce more offspring than can survive and reproduce. That's pretty much true of all species. Struggle, and that leads to, and this is where they're related to each other, that overproduction of offspring leads to the struggle for existence. Because more organisms are produced than can survive and reproduce, they compete for limited resources. So the struggle for existence is competition. So you could remember that simply as competition. Overproduction of offspring leads to competition. Competition between individuals of the same species, between individuals of different populations, between individuals of different species. There's all kinds of competition going on. And that leads to, right, number 3 leads to number 4 here, differential survival and reproduction. Individuals best suited to their environment, in other words, more fit, have higher fitness, survive and reproduce more offspring. That's what it's all about, to produce more offspring. You don't necessarily have to produce no offspring or the most offspring, just more offspring than other individuals. That makes you more fit. You're producing more offspring than other individuals. You have greater fitness or a higher fitness. So these organisms pass their adaptive traits. Those are adaptations, right? They pass their adaptive traits to their offspring. Other individuals less fit die and leave fewer offspring. So they don't pass on their traits they don't pass on as many of their traits to the next generation because they're less fit. So these 4 components, this process is natural selection and causes species to change over time. In other words, evolve. It's the primary mechanism of evolution, and that's what Darwin figured out. That's why we revere him. He was the first to figure out this mechanism of evolution and gather all kinds of evidence to support it. So what Darwin discovered, and what he realized from his discovery, is that it suggests that all species alive today descended with modification from ancestral species. In other words, the species that are alive today came from species that were alive in the past. And they are united into one tree of life. And that's what we're looking at here. This is a phylogenetic tree that is arranged a little bit differently. It's not going from bottom to top, like trunk to branches like a tree. It starts in the middle here with a last universal common ancestor, a leuca, and branches off into 3 major branches. And those 3 major branches are what we now consider the 3 domains of life. Archaea, which means ancient, bacteria, which you know what they are, and eukarya, that includes everything else. It's a completely different kind of cell than archaea and bacteria, and actually archaea and bacteria are different enough that they deserve to be in their own domains also. But the idea here is that all these branches lead back to one last universal common ancestor, the very first living thing on Earth. Or at least the very first living thing that gave rise to all other living things. Biology is not the only field of study that supports Darwin's theory. All evidence from all fields of science support the idea that species have changed over time through the process of natural selection. But like all theories, evolutionary theory is subject to change. So just because we've got this theory and we all know that it's fact in the scientific community, that doesn't mean that it's not evolving. The theory of evolution itself is evolving. It's changing. We're learning more about it. We're still studying it. And So evolution and the mechanisms that drive it continue to be discovered and studied and refined. And that's probably going to go on for forever.